Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to give it a couple of seconds for more people to join, and then we'll get underway. Okay, I think we're good to make a start. So welcome. Now, accessibility is important for individuals, businesses, and society. One of the strengths of our industry, digital learning, is that barriers to print, audio, visual media, etc., can be much more easily overcome than in other industries. But are we doing enough? And what does it say about our business and our duty of care if we exclude a single person from the same learning and development opportunities that everyone else has access to? Welcome to Kineo Conversations, where today we'll be discussing why accessibility is so important in digital learning as in life, what accessibility actually means, how it is so often overlooked, and how as we as digital learning technologists can help. My name is Andy Costello, Head of Customer Solutions at Kineo, and I'm truly delighted to be joined by...
So I'm Susi Miller. I'm an instructional designer. I'm also an e-learning accessibility consultant, and I'm also the author of Designing Accessible Learning Content.
Thank you, Susi. Yes, as you just mentioned there, you've published your book, Designing Accessible Learning Content, and we're pleased to say that we have a copy to give away today. So do hang on until the end to see if you get picked as our winner. Next up, Mark.
Yeah, so I'm Mark Dodkin, and I'm a learning solutions architect and strategist at SAP, and I help the internal learning community at SAP, supporting them with their solutions and goals.
Thank you, Mark. And finally, Pete.
Hi there, I'm Pete Smith. I am technical team lead for the bespoke content team here at Kineo.
Thank you very much. Thanks all for joining us. Before we get into it, just a bit of housekeeping. Now, as a reminder for those watching, please do add your questions into the Q&A tool. We've reserved the last 15 minutes at the end of this session for your questions. We'd love you to join the conversation, so let us know any questions you have. My colleague Alex will be keeping an eye in the background on all of these so that when we come to the Q&A at the end, she can come back and present them to us. We've also got the chat function open today as well, so feel free to add your comments as we go. Just make sure you select panelists and attendees if you'd like everyone to see your comment. And finally, and appropriately, I hope you'll agree, we've also got the live transcript auto-enabled at the bottom of your screen. Now you can keep these on, turn them off on your Zoom toolbar as best suits. Great. So without further ado, let's get the conversation started, shall we? And let's start with the broadest question of all. Beyond just doing the right thing, why is accessibility in digital learning so important? Susi, perhaps you'd like to start us off.
Yes, so I think that's a really great question, as you say, the sort of in the broadest sense. So I think digital accessibility, so making websites, digital services, social media, etc., accessible for disabled people is really important because it's basically a fundamental human right, and it's discriminatory not to do so. But I think that e-learning accessibility, when you think about just how much learning is delivered online nowadays, it's just as important, if not more so, because access to learning allows people to really achieve their potential. So if we create barriers in our learning by not making it accessible, actually what we're doing is limiting people's ability to learn and therefore to succeed, both so in our own education system, in the workplace, and I think ultimately, even in society.
Yeah, Mark.
I mean, I think that was very well put, Susi. I mean, and that's how we feel at SAP as well, is that it really provides people with equal opportunities to develop themselves, both personally and professionally. And, we saw that there was a real kind of gap there where, people didn't have the same opportunities that everyone else because content wasn't developed in such a way that, was consumable by all. And it's really empowering those learners to have those same opportunities and achieve their goals.
So Peter, what are your thoughts? How do we sort of keep these people in mind when we're catering for accessibility?
Well, I think throughout, you have to think of your whole audience when you come to design your piece of e-learning. So the very first thing to do is try to get a bit closer to them, understand the requirements of your e-learning, of the core audience who are going to be accessing it, and also understand how they're going to be accessing it, because actually a lot of the best practice which comes in from thinking about accessibility and applying the WCAG guidelines actually helps absolutely all learners. So including a transcript with your video, for instance, is also helpful for people who haven't got their headset in the office that day, or who are trying to access their e-learning on a mobile phone and don't want to switch their audio on. So it isn't, applying accessibility best practice is not just about making sure that you're reaching every single learner with specific accessibility need. It's also just generally applying good practice for your entire audience.
You mentioned guidelines there, the WCAG guidelines there, but what about legislation? You know, what's our legal obligation to provide accessibility? What other sort of guidelines and legislation is out there? Who wants to have a go at that?
I can speak for the U.S. We have the Americans with Disability Act, the ADA, and then and that was back. I guess that was written back in the 1990s, and it was actually written broadly with the intention that, you know, we would keep pace with evolving technology and continue to have reliance on it. And then we also have the Rehabilitation Act, which is the Section 504 and the 508, and all of them essentially state that, you know, we can't discriminate against people and really provide the abilities for them to be able to consume content, to be wherever necessary. The Section 504 is really around, you know, where programs are federally funded, that, you know, we can't discriminate there. And then Section 508 is really around those web technologies and communications, you know, being able to provide accessibles.
So the previous piece you mentioned, written in the 1990s, that things have obviously come on leaps and bounds since then. Has that been updated? Is there a need for it to be, or is it as applicable today?
I think it's you know, they wrote it in such a way that it is applicable today. So, and you know, I think it's really now where technology allows us to be able to build to accessibility, and where they're really starting to enforce this, you know, in a way that they haven't before. You know, I think it was difficult at best historically, and where, you know, people were maybe providing alternatives to certain pieces of content, but maybe partially so, you know, where we weren't providing the full experience for people that had accessible needs. And it was only kind of being able to check that box off, you know, meeting a certain need, like having somebody sit down with somebody to give them, you know, certain training, and it was always kind of abbreviated, you know. But now, because the tools and technology allow us to be able to better address accessibility, I think it's being enforced a lot more than it ever has been.
Thank you, Mark. Susie, what about in the UK? What are our
Yes, so we've got a kind of a similar thing. We've got the overarching anti-discriminatory law, which is the Equalities Act, and that has actually been around since 2010. And that really is quite an interesting piece of legislation, because it actually says that all organisations have an anticipatory duty to make reasonable adjustments for people with disabilities. And that's, you know, that anticipatory duty for me is a key phrase, really, because it's making sure that we're not waiting until someone comes to us and says that they have a need, that we've actually addressed that beforehand. But the interesting thing about the Equality Act is that it isn't particularly specific, although the W3C will say that it's underpinned by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, as you were talking about, Pete. But actually, we don't actually have any case law in the UK for for actually testing this. The kind of what if you're actually adhering to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So it's underpinning it, but we don't actually have, you know, it's not like in the States, where, as you were saying, Mark, there's a lot more legal action against people who you know, if things aren't accessible. But interestingly, in 2018, we had the public sector bodies accessibility regulations, which came in as a result of an EU directive. And that very explicitly states that to make something legally accessible in the public sector in the UK and in the rest of Europe, that it has to meet the WCAG requirements, and it's WCAG 2.1 and it's level A and AA. So I think for me, that's a hugely significant piece of legislation, because for the first time, it's really clearly set the benchmark for what we need to do to actually achieve accessibility. So even if you don't fall under those regulations, you might not be in the public sector. If you are, an organisation who wants to meet, to meet best practice, to meet legal, requirements, you know now clearly that that's what you should be aiming for.
These are obviously very easy to find for people if they're not sure.
The actual regulations.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just put in a quick reference guide to WCAG 2.1, you'll find it there.
Yeah,
great.
It's easy to find and not necessarily so easy to
yes, apply. Of course, yeah.
And I would say, Pete, and you could probably add to this, is that, I think most people and organizations and tools and things that, when they're trying to meet those accessibility guidelines, the acceptable level is the WCAG 2.1 now AA standards.
Yes, that is the standard that we're normally asked to meet. It goes up to AAA, which is also possible, but it's a stretchy target for a lot of e-learning. But we are finding, I think, just to echo what both of you were saying, Mark and Susie, that an increasing number of our clients are taking a really keen interest in this and are asking for AA accessibility to not just the public sector organizations who have to, but organizations who recognize that this is best practice. This is something which they should be doing. And while it is possible to offer alternative equivalent content to users who can't access the digital content for whatever reason, I think that's increasingly being seen as a second best. So it's used in exceptional circumstances. Whereas in the past, it was quite often the norm that organizations would say, oh, it's fine if someone is blind or has a severe visual impairment, that's fine. We'll make separate accommodation for them. Nowadays, that's a lot rarer.
And we have a duty of care, don't we, as providers or designers of learning, that if an organisation doesn't come to us to ask for guidance or accessibility, or doesn't really know, then we should be relaying this back to them, shouldn't we? We should be explaining to them, or at least asking the question about their users and advising them positively on it.
So I think for me, that is almost moving on one step from there, is really not being in that situation where you need to advise everybody that this is what they should be doing. It's almost thinking of, the ideal is accessibility is the default, because although I totally agree with Pete, what you were saying, it's really important to know the needs of your audience. I don't think you can ever anticipate the needs of your audience to know, who in that audience will have a particular access need. It's not the case that, that you have a look at a cross section of your audience and you'll say, well, we know that we'll have this, these people have got this access need or this disability or impairment. It's so much broader than that. You need to make sure that your learning is accessible as default, and then that almost it's just not an issue. I think that trying to define who is your audience and what are their needs is almost something that you shouldn't be doing anymore. We should just be saying, right, accessibility is where we should be for all of our learning.
Which I presume is why the guidelines are as broad as they are. They will apply to more people. I had a question about those kind of impairments and what can be improved by universal accessibility, but I suppose that's your point, Susie. It's not to think about the individual impairments as such, but what about people who may be listening in or watching in that have a known disability or a known cohort or learner type that has something? What would we say to them, and how would we start planning for it in our design?
So I suppose, the interesting thing about the web content accessibility guidelines is, although we're talking about them, the fact that they are quite difficult, the advantage of them is that they do cover the sort of broad four needs that we talk about when we're talking about digital accessibility, and that is your visual, your hearing, your cognitive, and your motor impairments. So I think if you do follow the guidelines, then you are encompassing all of the different types of access needs that you could have. there's a lot of criticism of the web content accessibility guidelines, particularly in relation to maybe cognitive impairments not going as far as they need to, but that they are addressing that. So I think at the broadest level, it's the understanding. I think there is a kind of a myth or a misconception that accessibility really is only about people with visual impairments. People quite often tend to think it's about people who are blind and are screen reader users. But I think if you stick to the broad principles of the web content accessibility guidelines, then you will cover a broad spectrum of people with disabilities. As I say, it's not perfect, but it's certainly, I've seen people who have come up with their own accessibility guidelines, which is a great start. But actually, I think that sometimes is risky, because you've got the web content accessibility guidelines, and they do cover those 4 basic principles, and they are improving, and they are also being updated in line with technology as well. So it's kind of, it's the basics that you've got there really. And also if you follow those four broad categories, then that comes back to our temporary and situational impairments. You're also making sure that your content is accessible for everybody really.
Mark, did you want to come in there?
No, I was just going to say, Susi, you kind of made a good point. When you talk about accessibility, what does that actually even mean? People first kind of go to blind and deaf, but it can be auditory, cognitive, neurological, physical, speech, visual. There's so many, disabilities now. And I know even for myself, getting older, I need readers all the time now. I can't read. And so just even color contrast and, small text on the screen, makes it hard to read. And certainly if I don't have my, glasses on, I can't see it. So, being aware of all these things and quite honestly, designing for accessibility is just really good, best practices for design, period. It's not talked about, I think, often, but just even search engine optimization, search engines and machine, looking at machines are very much like an accessible person, where it needs to look at good content structure. It needs to look at all the things that these assistive technologies need to look at to be able to make sense of the information that's provided. And search engines will actually bump up the relevancy of content based on how well it's structured. Does it have alt tags and titling, good titling, and links are defined properly and things like that. So all in all, it makes really for good design. Also chunking content and things like that. Being that people are using everything from their watches to their all these different mobile devices now, the content chunked out and well structured is then better displayed on all these different devices and provides different options for people. So
it's great you mentioned the search engine operability. I was doing some research in this as well, and the algorithms now are so much more sophisticated than ever before. So it's picking up things like UX as well. And if we design with all this in mind, the better the UX, the better the user behavior, I suppose, and the interactivity of the piece. And is that what you mean, Mark? That sort of will push those sites and those searches up the list more. So good business sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you're furthering your reach and everything else. It is very good business sense. So yeah, absolutely.
Great. Pete, technologically wise, and also for design, what other things should we be considering as part of the mix when we're designing for accessibility?
Well, I think, Susi, you've already alluded to the fact that the WCAG guidelines themselves aren't necessarily the easiest read. They're very much designed for web developers, first and foremost. And obviously with alongside the Adapt open source community, we spend an awful lot of time optimizing the technology and making it easy to make a course which is accessible by default, without the designers having to delve too deeply into the WCAG guidelines. That can be a bit of a double-edged sword though, because if you make it too easy, designers still need to have an understanding of what's going to work really well from an accessibility perspective and what's going to be a bit difficult. So it's possible to take the most accessible technology, which meets the WCAG guidelines to the nth degree, and still build a course which is not suitable, just by making a simple error like not meeting the color contrast, sticking images in which have got text in them, those sorts of problems. So I think there's still an education piece for designers, and also I think for some organizations commissioning the e-learning, there's also a bit of an education piece to understand why some things aren't acceptable, why some interactions are maybe less good than others. So the classic one that we always pick on is drag and drop as being one of the less accessible interactions available in e-learning frameworks. And it's also, unfortunately, a really popular interaction because it's quite hands-on, it's quite engaging for learners. But particularly if you've got learners who are trying to do a drag and drop interaction on a mobile phone device, it's a complete and utter nightmare. So it's one of the ones that isn't supported in Core Adapt. So it's those sorts of considerations. I think it's emphasizing that the course structure has got to be as simple as you can possibly make it. It should be linear. It should be a straightforward route through. You need to make the interface as consistent as possible, which is just plain good UX, and that's good for everyone. But it's particularly important for anyone who has maybe dyslexia or specific cognitive requirements. So it's all of those bits. And I think that's actually where the designers do need to go back to WCAG, and actually ideally the WCAG rules could do with having a bit more explanation for people with more of a designer kind of mindset.
But this is really exciting for designers as well, isn't it? So you mentioned about drag and drop being a nightmare, and I remember, then the challenge is to find an alternative. So the stick and click came out where you're matching pairs because you don't want to be swiping over a tablet, etc. So there is an opportunity there as well for designers to think outside the box, and of course that's what we do.
There is, although also very often the best solution is the simplest solution. So the best solution is actually not to put an interaction there, to have a better way of describing the content, explaining the content, and assessing whether the learner's got it.
But isn't that what we're doing at an ID standpoint, is basically telling people not to overthink, a solution, to keep it simple. And we're telling people that all the time, regardless. So, I mean, it's a good best practice anyway. But I think Pete made a good point about, when you point people to the WCAG guidelines, there's a lot there. And it gets to be pretty overwhelming. And I think that people historically, it's like, okay, it's not that I don't want to build something to meet accessible, requirements and things like that. It's just that, so we're putting on, IDs now. We're putting, in our learning organizations, we're saying, hey, look, not only you have to go through the ID process, analysis, design, develop, and but now you have, on top of that, we need to create stuff that's mobile friendly, and then we need to create stuff that's accessible. And by the way, you got to do this in 3 weeks, it's like, so people's heads are exploding, and so, how do we look at that process and kind of try to simplify it? And so what we've done at SAP was, with the WCAG guidelines, is to really kind of say, okay, well, with our processes and with our tools, how can we, just kind of feed them the things that they need? So we've created a, kind of a subset site that has, the principles there and the things that they need to focus on as IDs, utilizing the tools and the processes that we have in place. And, we're trying to simplify that, because they're not web developers. They're not going to be digging into the code and stuff like that. And then, of course, using tools like Adapt to be able to facilitate some of that process has been a real benefit. And it actually helps kind of drive the process a bit as well.
That's really interesting. You mentioned the dreaded timeline word earlier on there, and how we make things simple. There's a comment that's been come up in the chat from Cami, which says, seems like responsible partners should simply meet those minimum accessibility requirements and not wait to be asked. And of course, that's kind of the ideal world. That's what we want to do. But there are implications, are there not, like timelines, like potentially cost. What do we need to be aware of that we should be sharing with the clients, that kind of weighing up? Or is it, no, it's blanket, we just go out there, we meet those accessibility guidelines as standard? Who wants to pick this up?
I think I will, if that's right.
Yeah.
So I think that I think we need to be realistic about it. I think when people are beginning, like you were saying with Mark, there are so many different pulling in all different directions when you are an instructional designer or you're a developer. So accessibility just sometimes seems to be just another thing that you have to get your head around, and it feels a bit like a chore at the moment, I think. And I think it definitely, when you start on your accessibility journey, it does take time at the beginning. So I think for me, one of the really important things is that kind of the sort of leadership level is that you have capacity and you have the time that you need for training and to take that on board, because I think it's people who are at the chalk face know that it isn't that easy, and that it does take time and it does take longer to develop. Once you're kind of over that step, you might have templates, for example. You might have an accessibility statement that you can actually issue with your learning that takes into consideration maybe the limitations of the tool that you're using, and all those kind of things in place. Maybe champions who have more accessibility knowledge than maybe everybody in the team, but everyone has some basic knowledge. But I think you have to actually have support that is a requirement. It isn't just something that you can achieve without effort and without time and without resources. So for me, I think it's that kind of at whatever level of leadership you need to have that space to achieve accessibility.
One of the things, go ahead.
Yes, please, Mark, go.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, one of the things too now, really thinking about universal design, where, universal design is really about solving social problems and being able to provide a similar or the same experience to everyone. So I think we're talking about more than, going beyond providing just similar content or the same content, but providing the same experience to everyone. And the nice thing about technology and the tools like Adapt is being able to create an experience that accessibility doesn't look like, okay, we did all this other design stuff and we happen to plug in some accessibility stuff here and there, where it really feels like a very fluid experience for all. It's not disruptive for any one person, with their needs. And so, how do we design things in such a way that it feels right for everyone?
Yeah, and from a customer perspective as well, not just from an ID perspective from provider, but from a customer, what do people need to be aware of when they're considering accessibility from a time, cost, process point of view? Even technology, Pete, you mentioned Adapt, for example. What should they be looking out for in a way of getting started?
In a way of good, well, technology, having said it's not the whole answer, it is obviously part of the answer. So if you pick a good authoring tool, a good authoring environment, which has been built with the WCAG guidelines in mind, that will speed up the whole process of building accessible content. So that's probably, well, as a technologist, then obviously that's going to be the place that I'm going to go to first. Actually, a good example of this is the work that we've done with SAP on the open source Adapt framework, where with our original implementation of accessibility, which came out in version 2 of Adapt, we were quite pleased with it. We thought we'd done a really good job, and we got some pretty good feedback, and we won an award with ASADA, who are a sporting organisation in Australia and New Zealand. And we were pleased with ourselves, but then Mark came along from the open source community and said that the implementation wasn't actually up to scratch. He'd run it through the accessibility testing team inside SAP, and particularly the screen reader support didn't work in the way that screen reader users who are native users to screen readers would expect it to. So quite brilliantly, we partnered with SAP to completely and utterly rebuild that implementation for version 4. And so what came out of it is a tool which, certainly for the more complicated technical bit, which is screen reader support, it automates a lot of that. The instruction text for screen readers works better. We've got support for the shortcuts that screen readers need to use so they can quickly scroll through content in advance. And we've got all sorts of hidden areas which will read out this instruction text which doesn't appear anywhere on screen. So all of those things are available in the good e-learning frameworks, and that does make life a lot easier.
So you mentioned there, Mark, coming in. I was going to say to you, Mark, how do you then? You obviously spotted the errors, if you like. How do you test for accessibility?
Well, I mean, there's a number of different ways. I mean, there's a ton of tools out there. We actually have a accessibility testing center, so a group of folks that actually have a lot of the screen readers and things like that. And we have some accessible folks internally. So that's what we did. We worked with those folks and had them kind of thoroughly test the environment. And at the time, there were things where they were getting kind of lost in the navigation. They were getting caught up in what they call traps, where they were kind of, with some of the interactions, they caught up in loops. So they would it would totally disorient them and they kind of lose where they are. But I think, there's plugins, that you can use, and WebAIM has a lot of, .com has a lot of tools to test for, like they have Wave, and then they have the color contraster and things like that you can test for your color contrast. You can do simple things like in your browser, just go to, developer tools and inspect, and to see if, there's headings are set up properly. If you do a right click on images, you can see if there's all text on it and stuff like that. But I think that, as an organization where you set up good processes and you try to simplify the process, like I said, what we did was we tried to break out the parts within each category being perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, to be able to say, okay, in each one of these areas, these are the things that you need to focus on. And as Pete mentioned, in the way of navigation and intuitiveness, on being able to, we have ARIA labels, which is actually at the DOM level of the code, where screen readers will actually read this and provide additional information for folks on how to interact with certain interactions and things like that. So all of that's there. So there's a lot of things that, our designers and developers don't have to think about, but there are certain things that they do need to focus on, being they're having alt text, for their images, transcripts for their audio and video, and closed captioning and things like that. Yeah. So we provide all that information for them to be able to, work with, and then also enablement. Just, I think things like this, having these sessions, talking about the importance and talking about, how you're impacting everyone's experience by the content you're developing and your reach and stuff, and just add that education, I think is.
Thank you. Susie, does that match your experience?
Yeah, so it's really interesting when you're talking, Mark, because when I was writing the book, one of the things that I really wanted to do was in a way kind of democratize accessibility, to make it a little bit more, it's like you say, it's accessible for everybody. You're saying accessibility is accessible, but because there are there's so much negativity around the web, so many good things, but there's so much negativity around the web content accessibility and how technical they are, and how the fact that they've been written for web developers and not e-learning IDs and e-learning developers. So I really wanted it and when I started myself trying to decipher the web content accessibility guidelines, just feeling so out of my depth and thinking, I'm, so many times thinking, I'm just going to give up on this because it's too difficult. So I think with the writing the book, the whole point was thinking that I know that I'm not the only person who's in this position. And also I think my background in being in the public sector, I think if you're in a large organization, and what you're describing, Mark, is absolutely fantastic and what we would all love to have, but there are so many people who don't have those resources. And so what I wanted to do was really just have a resource that anyone could go to, which would kind of make it easier for people to understand. So when it comes to testing, I think there's quite a lot of testing that anybody can do. You don't have to be an expert. So even sort of, you can do basic testing without any tools at all. So for example, just making sure it's keyboard accessible, checking the timing, just basic things like that. And then I think the next level is testing with sort of very basic tools like your contrast checker, and you're just changing something to grayscale to make sure that you're not discriminating against people who are colorblind. But things like that you do. And then I think there is the sort of next level when you can assess, also start testing with assistive technology. And I really recommend everybody to have a go at looking at using a screen reader. You've got NVDA now, which is open source, and it's free. And I think, although when you compare that to someone who is actually an experienced screen reader, I'm a very, very basic screen reader user, but you can at least get the idea of a screen reader reading out all text, making sure that your reading order is correct. And then I think there is a whole section that I think you do need to have experts help. And obviously if you have the if you can, to have people with a lived experience of disability helping you with the testing is absolutely what everybody should be doing. But I just think that there are so many people who are literally just sort of a one person in their organization, and accessibility is falling on them. The book is kind of written for where you start, and it's almost anybody can do a certain amount themselves. And then in an ideal, we're coming back to screen reader testing, the idea that I'm a very basic screen reader tester. Sometimes when you're testing with a screen reader, it can be really beneficial when you're starting, because you get a real idea of what it's like to access your content with a screen reader. But then sometimes you're getting false negatives because you can't do something that a screen reader can do, because they're an experienced and they know how to use the technology better than you. So it's a kind of it's almost, it's a brilliant thing that everybody should be able to do as much testing as they can. But at certain points, it really is beneficial to go to experts, as you were saying, Mark.
Right. Well, and Susie, wouldn't you agree that, we try to get people to start with the process of really refining your content, really making good, clear content. I mean, so that's a huge start, is chunking out your content, labeling and titling it properly, putting good instructions in there. And that makes, a good experience for everyone. I mean, and because what happens is if your content doesn't flow properly and you don't have good titling, these people, especially blind, they get lost. They can't follow. They're trying to follow in their head as this, the audible is being fed to the audio is being fed to them, and trying to understand the information, the context of what you're providing. And if that's not structured right, they get totally lost. And so that's, we try to get people to focus on that, just
Great
as
start.
a real fundamental, thing. So.
And that's just good learning design, isn't it? It's good accessible
Absolutely.
design is the principles of good design and good communication.
And one for me is an instruction one. When you're giving people instructions, I think that's a real, especially for quiz questions. What I see a lot when I do a lot of auditing is both not consistency in the questions that you're asking, not consistency in your feedback, and I think that's a real, for me, that's exactly as you say, Mark. That is just good design, good instructional design, and good, sort of respect for your learner. To it's not making it as clear as possible, telling them just a simple thing, how many options they can select, instead of assuming that people know what you want them to do. It's that's really at the key of sort of the good instructional design, which is also really important for assistive technology users.
There's somebody put a comment in the chat, Steve Moray, who has found a Chrome extension really useful. Steve, thank you. Shared a link there. It's actually shared to panelists at the moment, so we'll make sure that gets shared out to all attendees as well. And we're getting some good questions come through as well. Just a quick word on Adapt, if I may. Mark, you chose it at SAP. What were your main reasons for choosing Adapt?
Well, there were a number of reasons, you know, and
just to be sorry, I should give some Mark, give some context. Adapt is the authoring framework for the creation of the content that you were using at for your projects.
Right. So, you know, at the time, this was back in, I think it was like 2015 that we first started looking at Adapt, and you know, we had a vision at SAP to help the world run better and improve people's lives, and so part of that vision and part of our learning strategy was to be able to create content that was mobile friendly and accessible. Those were the top of our list. And, you know, and then also to have greater impact beyond ourselves, and looking at Adapt being open source, you know, having an open framework built on the web-based technologies and things like that. You know, we saw it as being something that was extensible. It already had, you know, some great bones to it, and you know, and met a lot of our initial requirements. And you know, I reached out to Pete early on, and you know, we had some conversations, and we felt like, you know, this was something that we can grow into and not grow out of, and it could meet a lot of our initial needs. And it was something, because it was so extensible and because of our partnership, we would be able to kind of, you know, extend it out. And as Pete had mentioned, we, you know, we looked at all the great things that it had, and they had the, you know, Pete and I talked about this, is that, you know, I mean, you can tell too that accessibility wasn't just an afterthought. It wasn't just something that was saying, okay, and by the way, let's make it accessible. It was something that was, you know, something that was part of their initial architecture. And, you know, this is something that we wanted to be able to build onto, and fortunately we would be able to do that. And we even want to kudos out to Kineo and our partnership. When we were able to win an award on Brandon Hall Gold Award for, you know, all the work that we did around accessibility and stuff. So so it's been a real game changer. And I think also, I had kind of mentioned this earlier, is that I think it's really helped to facilitate the process and to kind of help drive some of the change within our organization for people to accept, you know, accessibility as a standard, as a, you know, as a norm. Because, you know, I think before, you know, approaching accessibility was so overwhelming for folks that it was just like, okay, you know, we'll just have somebody sit down with them and feed them the content, or we'll give them a PDF or something, and you know, and that can be read by the screen. There's always a kind of a subset of the experience. And so now with the tool, you know, it has been a real game changer, you know, to say, hey, look, you know, if you use this tool and use the way it's designed, and you follow these handful of principles, some of these basic concepts, we can create, all of our content can be, you know, very accessible. And, you know, and it's kind of really kind of catapulted the whole process. So.
Thank you, Mark. That's really quite poignant that we've done for too long the least we've needed to, because of not knowing to do better, I guess. I'm aware that we want to sort of open up to questions. Susie, I just thought some further thoughts for you before we open it up to some of the Q&A.
I think there's this quote about accessibility, about the fact that it takes you know, more time to make things accessible. And I saw something on social media the other week. You know, sometimes you see something that's a real light bulb moment, and it said, making your content accessible doesn't take longer. It's just that you were cutting corners before. And I thought, actually, that that's where we're at. This is where we need to be. That accessibility, like I keep saying, is just the default. It's just, we need to do everything to get us to the place where accessibility isn't even an issue anymore. So all the things we're doing with tools is great, but also giving people the ability to kind of understand accessibility and apply it to e-learning, the context. Coming back to our question at the beginning, really about, it's just so fundamental that we allow people to access learning. That's basically what we're all about. We spend our whole lives trying to make our learning as engaging and interactive and interesting as possible, but sometimes we're just missing that accessibility piece, which means that automatically, we're talking about statistics, I think, in our catch up before, but it is between 12 and 26% of your audience, although we don't need to sort of narrow it down, that amount of people you're excluding by not making things accessible. So
which makes no business sense at all. Why wouldn't we? Sorry, Mark.
No, I was just going to mention, I mean, we're kind of limiting people's potential, really, and so by not creating content that's accessible. I mean, we have people in our organization, everybody has different needs, and to be able to create content in such a way that people can get the most out of the experience and just kind of elevates people to a whole new level. And I think affording everybody those opportunities to develop themselves both professionally and personally is not only our duty to create that way, but I mean it's the right thing to do, and it helps everybody. I mean, everybody benefits from that. So.
And eventually it should be the unspoken, the norm, just as the best navigation is on a screen, it should be invisible. So should any kind of efforts for accessibility. It should just be done. Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Great. I wanted to bring my colleague Alex in now. We've got some good chat, I think, Alex, and some good questions. Hello.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
Hi. So over to you, really. Do you want to take a pick of some of the Q&A we've got? There's one there that I thought was the top one from Paul.
Yeah, sure. So we've had some good engagement in the Q&A. Thanks, everyone. Keep the questions coming. So Paul asks, is there a get out clause, which is an interesting start to a question, from the legal requirements for certain content? So I guess we're talking about e-learning content here rather than general web content. But for content that is aimed at users who, by the nature of their job, cannot have any vision impairment. So, for example, airline pilots. I think this probably comes back to the base of, thinking about your specific learner audience.
Yeah, and is there a legal requirement to make everything accessible? And if there is, what about that content where you would not normally have to consider accessibility, I suppose? Over to anyone.
I think that's a tricky one to answer from a kind of that this is where you see, even when you're talking to, government digital service, they'll go, oh, well, you have to refer this to a lawyer because it is, that is where you're getting into a real legal complexity. So I think there's this thing of disproportionate burden, which is not quite the same. It's a bit more like, if your organization, if accessibility, you can prove, you have to have real strong financial proof that, making something accessible is a disproportionate burden to your organization. That's kind of one area, but I'm not sure that this would really fall under. I mean, logically, you can see that in some examples you couldn't make something accessible. So I think one of the things that I think is really important is coming back to the public sector bodies accessibility regulations. You have an accessibility statement that is a requirement of the legislation, and that gives you the ability to say what level of accessibility you're at. So how you're meeting the WCAG standards, if there's any that you aren't meeting, and then also giving an alternative for that case. So if again, I would say that an accessibility statement is good practice for any learning. So even if you're not in the public sector, so and also you give a kind of a contact detail for if anyone is having any access issues. And for me, again, coming back to making accessibility more accessible, I think that for people who have maybe a tool that isn't necessarily as good as Adapt, maybe in the accessibility things, it gives you a way of mitigating, you know, that you're still doing your very best to make it as accessible as you can, but maybe you have limitations in the tool, or maybe in this situation you have limitations in the situation, and that is something that you could maybe consider putting in a best practice accessibility statement. So at all, not at all a legal
Sure.
a legal answer, just
So we have
thoughts.
I was just going to say, we have at SAP, we have some, internal learning guidelines around accessibility where, if you're going to host content on our learning management system, and you're deeming it or classifying it as mandatory or compliance, there's certainly obligation there to make that accessible. And I think at that point, you have a legal responsibility to make that accessible, because of the fact that you're saying, hey, look, we're saying you have to take this, and so obviously if people can't consume that content, you need to find a way for them to be able to do that. I mean,
there's a lovely point that Douglas has just made in the chat there, that not all disabilities are permanent. So an airline pilot can take the time to do some e-learning courses while recovering from an eye condition. Again, back to the default status. Good stuff, Alex.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. Yeah, so the next question's come in from Ben. The panel mentioned how people often focus on visual or audio impairments when considering accessibility. Are there any accessibility concerns that you feel are often overlooked, maybe things like colour blindness?
Yeah, I mean, I know at SAP, some of the things that people have done and things that people sometimes overlook is even just the use of how you're calling out links, like click here. So people do that kind of thing, where you're not giving any kind of descriptive information around what that link is, or referencing a color, where you're telling people, hey, click on the blue button, where people aren't sure, or rendering text as part of an image, and not putting good alt text to that image. So where you're expecting people to, get that information by looking at the image that you're providing that has all this text on it. Screen readers are not going to read that. So some of those things are many times things that people end up overlooking and, and putting in their content. So.
There was a question that's come up in the chat there, Alex. I was just going to jump to that because it's kind of related to the tech that we were talking about before, and that's how panelists, maybe one more for you, Pete, or Mark, sorry, Susie, but how panelists would compare Adapt to other solutions such as Storyline. Is it suitable for use by instructional designers rather than someone with more technical experience? So a bit more of a design. And for you, Susie, of course, you would have used both, I'm sure, so apologies. But what do we think?
I'm happy to go first on this, although I should caveat my answer by saying that I am a bit partial. I have a vested interest in Adapt. Obviously, I think it's the best.
A little bit.
A Storyline does meet WCAG 2.1 standards. It is possible to create accessible e-learning in it. And indeed, at Kineo, we do create accessible e-learning in it. There is, similarly with Lectora as well, with maybe a little bit more effort. I think there's nuance here, though, and the nuance is around usability. So it's not just, you can meet the letter of the WCAG guidelines and still produce a course which doesn't really meet your learning objectives to people who have certain specific accessibility needs, because you're still putting an extra cognitive load on them. So the struggle is still, how do I get through this content? How do I use this interaction, rather than the focus being purely on what is the content, what is the thing that I'm trying to learn? And that's where some tools really work better than others. The idea is that the tool itself should just shrink into the background, so all the focus is on the content. So yeah, certainly from talking to our QA team, who regularly test with screen readers, the feedback has always been that the more modern versions of Adapt are easier to use with screen reader technologies. For other things like color contrast, it's actually just as easy to get color contrast wrong with Adapt as it is with anything else, and make basic mistakes in the content. So
but that's why you have the themes, though. you know, where you can set up a theme where it sets those styling, the font sizes, the, you know, all the color, you know, backgrounds and things like that. One of the things I would say with some of those other tools that were mentioned is the fact that, you know, when you have an open canvas, there's a whole lot more that you have to think about in the way of navigation, tab order, and all those things. And so where Storyline and some of these other tools, you know, like you said, Pete, you can achieve a certain level of accessibility. It just is a lot more you got to think about, and a lot more you have to put into it to make that work. You know, where adapt, you know, and I'm a bit biased of myself, is that just makes it a whole lot easier because a lot of that's already baked in. So.
Right. Thanks, Donald, for that question. Alex, back to you.
Cool. Yeah, one other question I wanted to ask before we start closing, probably. Are there certain types of digital learning that just won't work from an accessibility point of view? So things like gamification or VR. And in those instances, do the panel think that all learning experiences need to be fully accessible, or can you create separate experiences for those that need it?
Susie, do you want to have the first?
Yeah, it is interesting, because I think it comes back to really this idea that again, this kind of misconception, I think, that accessible learning is kind of very basic, and you can't do anything, you can't be interactive. And I think that is a myth that people still hold on to. You know, they think it's this either or opinion. It's either it's either interactive or it's accessible. And I think if you look beyond our industry, so a really great example for gamification is a fantastic, the most accessible game that I don't know if either of you are aware of this, but it's the most accessible game. I think it's got 66 accessibility features. I think it's The Last of Us Part 2 or something, and it was released this year. I can't remember, it's like recently. So if you look beyond our industry, we are able to make gamification. People are able to have the technology to make gamification accessible. And similarly with VR, again, VR people will often just discount as not being able to make accessible, but there is a lot of work going on to make VR accessible in other industries. You know, there's lots of people who are making accessible for people with a range of different impairments. So I think we tend to be a little bit narrow in learning and development, and we tend to think, okay, well, our tool doesn't do this. I think if we look beyond our industry, you can make, it's that innovation that is so amazing about accessibility is you can make things accessible. You just need to be thinking in a different way. Brilliantly put. Thank you. Mark, last thoughts?
No, I mean, a lot of great stuff here. I mean, I think that I think that we need to kind of make accessibility part of our mindset and part of our thinking, and think about it in such a way that, we're trying to create the best learning experience that we can for everyone. And I think it starts with good content and following the process, and good instructional design, and then, utilizing tools and resources that we have available. And yeah, I mean, I think yeah.
Great. Thank you. And Pete, of course, that's what the heart of the latest versions of Adaptive, you said, and everything we need to do is good learning design content providers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's worth making the point that we're not an end state with any of the technology. So actually kind of picking up on your point, Susie, that you can get things up to a certain point of accessibility at the moment, but the main thing is not to sit back and rest on your laurels. This is something that is going to need continual development and continual improvement as technology changes, as people adapt differently to technology and have different sets of expectations. So as we keep pushing forwards, we need to keep doing that with accessibility very much front and center of mind, and we need to keep investing in it as a technology company.
Like with all the best and important things. Look, great stuff. Really good chat. Thank you, everybody. Now, we mentioned as well, I'm just aware of the time, Alex, Susie's just published a book on this very topic. It's available to purchase now. And we have just added a promo code to the chat. So you'll get 15% off if you use this code. However, one of you might not need to use the code, because we also said that there will be a lucky winner. Somebody drawn out of a hat at random. Alex, could you come back on? Who's the lucky winner of
yeah,
of
so
Susie's
we've
books?
done the prize draw, the random draw, and it's Alice Denham who has won. So hopefully Alice is still on. But Alice, I'll grab your details and I'll be in touch tomorrow to talk to you about sending you a copy of Susie's book.
Wonderful. Well done, Alice, sorry, and thank you, Alex. But brilliant. Look, all that remains really for me to say is thank you to all our panelists, Susie, Mark, and Pete, for your time today. A great conversation. Thanks to everybody that's joined us. Following the session, you'll receive a link to the recording, and for everyone who's registered, you'll also receive exclusive access to our Adapt short course, How We Build Accessible Courses. It's a short course that we've built to the AAA standards, so you can see how we approach that and test it out for yourselves. But hopefully this has opened your eyes to some of the key reasons why it's critical to address accessibility standards in e-learning and all digital learning, and headed off at the start, and so that it becomes the norm in everything we do in all your content design. If you have any questions, you'd like to pick up the phone and have a chat or email us, then please do. Details on the screen. But that's it. Thank you very much, and good luck with all your endeavors, and we look forward to hearing from you and continuing the conversation next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.